I'm James Root. I'm a faculty member at the New School for Social Research, where I also trained. And I got into neuropsychology, which is what I'm doing now, and neuroimaging. Really, it started with an undergraduate degree in philosophy. And I was interested initially in psychotherapy when I got into the New School. And then Marcel Kinsborn, who's a behavioral neurologist, came along in the faculty there and really kind of inspired me to think about the philosophy of consciousness and brain function more generally. And that's how I got interested in neuropsychology. And so neuropsychology is really the study of brain-behavior relationships. So trying to understand what part of the brain controls what kinds of cognitive or other kinds of behavior. So some misconceptions about the brain, it's probably one that people have heard before, is this idea that we use only 10% of our brain. And I'm actually not sure where that idea comes from. It could be that the areas that we understood to be functioning when people were doing any kind of cognitive or behavioral task, that we only understood 10% of the areas that were known to be functioning. But really, at all times, whether you're at rest or you're in activity, your brain is always taking up glucose and oxygen and all sorts of metabolic processes, and it's supporting any number of different activities. And so even what we've realized lately is that there's something called the default mode network, which is a network of brain areas that are active at rest, and so and reliably active at rest. And they seem to be related to when people are internally preoccupied or aren't otherwise stimulated by things that are going on outside of them. That actually is very active at rest, and then when people are stimulated, that brain area or that network actually decreases in activity. They call it a task-related deactivation. And that's when all the other sensory processes start to go online, and that you see those areas reliably lighting up. So not only do we use all of our brain all of the time, but that there's even at times when you think the brain should be at rest, it's actually very much active, and it's really taking up a lot of energy. So the development of the human brain really goes over the lifespan. So a lot of people might think that the development of the brain occurs from maybe when the person is born to maybe 5 or 10 or 15 years old. And what we're realizing is that development really occurs throughout into old age. It just might not be the development that we all think of, meaning a gradual accumulation of abilities and of differentiation of brain structure. So in terms of plasticity of the brain, this is a really hotly debated topic, and there's no doubt that plasticity occurs. And plasticity is just to say, let's say once, to make it easier, once you have the brain is fully myelinated and developed and so on, If you sustain an injury, a stroke, where you have a sudden disruption of the blood supply to one area or another, and whatever function was supported by that area of the brain, plasticity would suggest that another area of the brain can take over responsibilities that damaged area used to be responsible for. All that said, what we do see is, in some cases, and it's again, it's a matter of debate, is when you have, let's say, a stroke in a primary language center, or let's say a brain tumor in a primary language center. There's and so that would be typically a left hemisphere function, particularly dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so up here in the front of your brain on the outside, that you see a kind of compensatory lighting up or activity of the right hemisphere in similar areas. Now again, that area wasn't a non-language area to begin with, this right side area. It might have participated in other aspects of language production, but it tends to come online even stronger and exhibit activity even more so when its left-sided counterpart is damaged to some extent. Plasticity also occurs early in development with, for instance, early, say, sensory loss, blindness, or deafness, or even in the case of somatosensory cortex, the part of your cortex that's actually, processing physical sensation or motor output. When you lose function in any one of these modalities, in sight or in hearing, or if you lose one part of your body that would otherwise, that signal that is emanating in that part of the body would be translated in your brain, that those areas actually undergo plasticity, if you want to call it that the cortical areas tend to change in their morphology or their shape or their volume, or be kind of reassigned to other kinds of activities. And so that's another aspect of plasticity, another form of plasticity. But all this to say is the brain is changing dramatically over the lifespan and just a normal development from early on in infancy to kind of early adulthood, where it kind of maintains somewhat kind of a stability, but then as early as 40, 45, you're starting to see changes in the opposite direction, and then as late as 65, 70, 75, you're starting to see atrophy, which is a shrinking of the brain, and also you're starting to see these white matter changes, these demyelination changes that are kind of related to normal aging as well. So the research that I'm conducting right now is based on something that is called cue reactivity. And so, what this is that the paraphernalia that surrounds various addictive behaviors becomes reinforcing, and it becomes kind of an appetitive kind of stimulus in and of itself. And so this could be things like a pack of cigarettes, a cigarette itself, a burning cigarette, seeing someone on the street smoking a cigarette. All these things are what we call cues. And cue reactivity just means that people who are addicted to whatever that substance is will process that information in a different way than someone who isn't addicted. And what that means is that someone who is a smoker, their attention will be more easily drawn to someone else who's smoking, or their attention will be more easily drawn to a smoking advertisement on a kiosk or something like that. And that when their attention is drawn more easily, that this kind of appetitive network, or this reward network in their brain, this ventral tegmentum, nucleus accumbens, to basal ganglia, to frontal lobes, starts to change its behavior as well in response to that cue. And these are all things that probably are occurring outside of the person's awareness. They don't recognize that their eyes are being diverted to something that is kind of related to their addictive behavior, but it is. So this is pretty important when you think about advertising for cigarettes. As a key example, is that the more that cigarette advertisements are up in view of people on a day-to-day basis, if this is a pre-attentive or pre-conscious process, that stimuli that are otherwise unattended to by that person are setting off a process that might actually increase the chances of them engaging in that addictive behavior. And so it really lends itself to this question of how in control are people of their own thoughts about the addictive substance. The biological underpinnings of addiction, obviously they kind of involve the entire brain. There's not just one area or another that's involved in addiction, but one thing we're realizing is that one real common pathway in addictive behavior, and what supports it and reinforces it, is something called the ventral tegmental area, the ventral tegmentum, and then the nucleus accumbens. And so here, what you see is, let's see, the ventral tegmentum. So this is on top of the brainstem, or just on the kind of superior portion of the brainstem here. And this is a major area, like the substantia nigra. It's a major area that is producing and very much involved in dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine. And so what we've come to realize is that with information that is relevant to an addictive substance, for instance, cocaine or nicotine or alcohol or methamphetamines, that even information that's related to that, or cues that are related to that, a pack of cigarettes or an ashtray or a line of Coke or a mirror, these kinds of things, that those kinds of stimuli, even not the substance itself, can stimulate or can make this area more active. And this area then releases more dopamine, and then this is very much involved in projections to the nucleus accumbens, which is here. And this is kind of here's the side view of the brain, this one here, and it's showing where the nucleus accumbens would be. And so the nucleus accumbens is very much involved in processing reward, in processing patterns of stimuli, or in situations of the environment where reward might be reliably gotten. And then that in turn has projections into other basal ganglia structures, which are kind of these areas here, and then all into the frontal lobes here. The frontal lobes obviously are kind of controlling a lot of motivated, conscious, voluntary behavior. And so you can see that from the ventral tegmentum to the nucleus accumbens, and then through these basal ganglia areas, and then into the frontal lobes, you're seeing that this kind of whole system of motivated, addictive and motivated behavior. And so it brings up the whole question of, is there such a thing as internet addiction? And certainly there's a lot of researchers out there who claim that there is. You know, the difference between an addiction and a conditioned response is a very difficult one to delineate. And so by that, what I mean is that an addiction, you can imagine, this is something that people participate in for some kind of a perceived pleasure, whether it's alcohol or nicotine or amphetamines, that they're going after a certain feeling and their brain changes in response and then ultimately starts to kind of, subjectively at least, require that substance. Internet addiction or internet use, or let's say repeated internet use, you could think of it in a different way as well. You could think of it in that way. Or you could think of it in the way of classical conditioning. And so classical conditioning is just where you're training an organism to do a certain, or to have a certain response in response to a certain kind of a stimulus. And there's something called operant conditioning, which is where you can train an animal or a person to, say, press a lever in response to get a reward. And so in some ways there's an overlap between that and addiction, in that they're both, there's an instrument, there's a behavior that leads to a certain desired outcome. With internet use, or with heavy internet use, one way you can imagine it is it's an example of kind of imperfect reinforcement or imperfect reward. And that kind of goes against what you might think, right? Is that the more consistent a reward, you'd think that you'd get the more consistent behavior that elicits that reward. But in fact, what we find is that the less consistent the reward, the more surprising the reward is, the more enforced or reinforced that behavior that leads to that reward is. And so when you think about something like the internet, and you think about something like email, or text messages, or chats, or anything else like that, that's a positive outcome, right? What you're getting is a reward. And so the behavior that leads to that is you're checking your phone or your email or the internet to find that. And similarly, I would argue that new content on a blog that you always follow, or anything, or news items or something like that, that's the reward, and then the behavior is actually checking it. And so to some extent, what we have in the internet culture is really inconsistent reward, and it's the most strong reinforcement you can have for a behavior. And so whether it's an addiction or not, I'm not sure. I'm sure there's going to be further work to be done on that. But I think really, I think the most cautious way to look at it would be this kind of inconsistent rewarding of behavior that also then just reinforces that behavior very strongly. And so what you see is people really engaging in this constant checking of their phones, and I think that's probably the most kind of obvious form it takes. And so it becomes even just the other side of it, it becomes just strange for someone to sit there kind of inertly, not doing anything, where probably it was more typical before.